Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this UCL Minds lunchtime lecture. And we're really pleased to have you all here with us today from around the world and from the UK. And I've just briefly introduced myself. So I'm Kerry Jewett, and I'm going to be chairing this lunch hour lecture. I'm a professor of technology and learning, and I'm based in the UCL Knowledge Lab, which is a specialist research centre in the Department of Culture, Communication and Media within the Institute of Education, which is a faculty within University College London. And I'm also the chair of the UCL Collaborative Social Science domain. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce my colleague, Lili Golmohammadi. I'll tell you a little bit about her, and then I'll introduce her lecture, and then I'll hand over to Lili. So Lili's a member of the In Touch project team, which I'm a director of, and that is a 5-year European Research Council funded project, which is based at UCL. And the project investigates the social impact of digitally mediated touch technologies. So the kinds of technologies that you see in your everyday life, but also advanced touch technologies like robotics, or the ways that touch is being brought into virtual reality, the ideas of touch and biosensing, so a whole range of different types of technologies. And the project asks how they're shaping the ways in which we touch. Lili is researching the relationships between these technologies, loneliness, and touch. And alongside her work at UCL, Lili also researches design education at Goldsmiths College, part of University of London. And her research interests include digital communication technologies, critical design, and design education. And you'll get a sense of those different interests coming together in this talk that she's going to give you. So the lunch hour lecture will explore early findings from Lili's research on connections between loneliness, touch, and emerging digital technologies. It will draw on a creative online workshops series that she facilitated from May to December in 2020, so at the core of lockdown in the UK. And that work was with 6 participant groups, including people over 70, professionals aged 25 to 55 working from home, and young people aged 18 to 24. As Lili will talk to you about the physical and psychological and emotional benefits of touch for our well-being, our development, and for just feeling connected are very well documented. Yet physical distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic has prohibited most social touching, and our everyday interactions largely lack tactile experiences as a result. And that raises questions about the potential value of bringing touch into the realm of the digital. At present, though, commercial touch technologies are at a very early stage of development. And in this lecture, Lili will discuss how her research participants talked about touch and digital touch through their experiences of loneliness, through imagining their own digital touch designs and engaging with other design-led methods, and how that can inform the future design of digital touch technologies. So before I hand over to my colleague Lili, I just want to give you a little bit of information about how to manage the questions and answers. So we'll be taking questions through an app called Slido. There's information about this on the event information you received via email. But you can just go to Slido, which is sli.do, and enter the code LHL2. That's all capitals, and I'll quickly say that again. So the URL is sli.do, and the code, all capitals, is LHL2. And we can take questions through at the end of Lili's lecture, but you can ask questions throughout her talk. So it's a pleasure now to hand over to Lili for the lecture. Thank you, Lili.
Thank you, Kerry, for that great introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen. So just give me one moment as I set this up for you. Okay, so can you see my screen, full screen, Kerry?
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I'll minimize there and okay, so hello everybody, I'm Lili, and as Kerry has already said, I am a researcher with the InTouch project at UCL, and I'm going to talk to you about some early findings from my work on loneliness, touch and digital touch technologies. And to clarify, as Kerry sort of hinted at, these are technologies that go beyond the everyday smart screen that we're all familiar with. So things like robotics, technologies that you can wear on the body, and other kinds of devices which digitally translate or deliver touch in some way. And I'll show you some examples shortly if that's something that's new to you. It'll be quite interesting, I imagine. So I'm still looking at the data, and this is still very much a work in progress. The talk will last around 25 minutes, and then we should have a very good chunk of time for questions. And I'm really interested to hear those questions, so please do put them in Slido as we go, and Kerry and I will respond later. So the main question that I'll be addressing today in this talk will be, how do people frame touch and digital touch in loneliness? But before I introduce the early findings, I'd like to give you just a quick bit of background to the project and what it's involved. So back in 2018, when I began this project, thinking about loneliness, touch and the digital actually felt quite obscure. And there were a very small number of studies, and these were mostly in healthcare and lab settings. But of course, the pandemic's made many of us think a lot more about touch and loneliness. And this, of course, has been reflected in the huge increase of news stories, which many of you will now be familiar with. So loneliness. Loneliness is quite a slippery thing to define. People define it and experience it very differently, and it can take many forms. And sometimes it might not even be obvious to a person that what they're experiencing actually is loneliness. It's quite a hard thing to really pin down. But loneliness is distinct from social isolation, which refers to the amount of social contact a person has. But of course, a person might have a lot of social contact, but still feel lonely, and vice versa. And this is where the difference comes in. Loneliness is much more subjective. And the literature often describes it as the difference between the level and quality of social engagement a person has and the level that they want to have. And on this slide, you can see a few participants' definitions from my study. There was a real range, but one that came up a lot was a sense of disconnection. This could be from the self, from others, and the wider world. So to give you a few examples shown here, one participant's put, having all the numbers, but not feeling like I have anyone to call. A lack of connection. And another said, loneliness is the disconnection from self, others, a direction or purpose, value and place within the world. And the difficulty of pinning loneliness down is also captured in another definition where someone's written, I don't really know, I suppose I enjoy solitude. Loneliness is something much more grave. I could tell you when it happens, but not how. So some interesting things to, as a start point, that shows just how complex it is. Touch too has many different facets. It's complex and deeply personal, and not everyone has a positive relationship to it, of course. But as Kerry said, research has shown that touch has very important physical, psychological and emotional benefits, and is incredibly important for our well-being and development. And because we know that touch has so many benefits, there's been a lot of interest in bringing these tactile options to our digital communications. And the digital realm has largely been lacking these. So there's been a lot of reflection on that, especially recently. So there's been lots of questions about the potential for these technologies in the pandemic. And here you can see an article about the potential for robots to help with loneliness in times of social distancing. So the promises and hopes are the space, and problems are the space that my study is situated in. But yeah, as Kerry's also said, many of these technologies are at an early stage. Only a few are very commercially available. They're often a bit glitchy, and others are speculative, meaning at the moment not all the technology is there just yet. So just to give you a couple of quick examples, the picture in the middle at the bottom shows a pair of footsie slippers, which imagines the possibility for couples to play footsie at a distance. And the picture on the bottom right shows a bear, which is actually a commercial piece, which mirrors the movements of a loved one's hands over distance. So with these promises, hopes and problems, this is the space that I'm working in. I've been working in with this question of how people frame touch and digital touch in loneliness. So to give you an overview of the fieldwork and the methods, just briefly, I started with a pilot at the Wellcome Collection in late 2019. And then from May to December 2020, I ran a 3-part online workshop series. And that was with 6 groups with around 4 participants in each group. And following this, between December 2020 and May this year, I trialed a technology called the Hay Bracelet, which I will explain shortly. And this was with 3 pairs of participants. And the 2 latter stages were run with 3 demographics: over 70s, people aged 25 to 55, working from home, and younger adults aged 18 to 24. And overall, this was a small scale project, so involving around 35 participants overall in total. And it's important to note that although most of the fieldwork took place during the pandemic, the study was not exclusively exploring touch and loneliness during this period. And the fieldwork involved a lot of creative methods and activities, which I won't be detailing too closely today, but if you'd like to know more, please do check out the blog post on this page where I wrote about the methods and using them online. And I believe there'll be an email after this talk sent out, so we can include the link in that email for you if you're interested. But to give you a quick flavour, some of the things we did included mapping experiences of loneliness over a time period that a participant chose to focus on, and then trying to frame touch within that. I also showed participants examples of digital touch designs which directly or indirectly spoke to loneliness, and asked participants for their thoughts. And then I also asked participants to make quick mock-ups of their own touch technology ideas for this space. And then in between the workshops, I gave participants some creative prompts, or digital probes, as I've called them, to respond to. And I use these creative methods and this creative approach because, for the most part, as I've hinted at, we really aren't used to thinking or talking about touch or loneliness, and it's quite a challenge to do that. And of course, these technologies are still very new, and for a lot of people, they're still quite hard to get your head around. So there's a lot going on there and a lot to process. So that's why I sort of set up this methodology, this 3-part series. Okay, so now I've given you some background. Let's take a look at some early findings from the study, which speak to this question of how people make sense of and frame touch and digital touch in loneliness. So for 4 early findings, the first is, perhaps no surprise to many, that touch is comforting for moments of loneliness. But what's interesting here is that this idea of touch is expanded in lots of different ways. So human touch was important, but participants also spoke about touch from animals, the natural world, objects, and the feel and sensations of particular materials. And with humans, some participants spoke about touch not just as physical contact, but also as proximity, or being physically near to others. So all these comforted by giving a sense of connection, reassurance, and anchoring. And especially when discussing contact with living beings, people often spoke about touch as a way to vent, to diffuse, and detach from loneliness. In relation to the pandemic, it's really human touch and closeness that's been the focus, and experiences of this in relation to loneliness were actually varied. So for some participants who had strong tactile boundaries, meaning they often find touch quite difficult and mostly avoid it, touch can be lonely making because they feel they don't fit in, they don't fit social expectations of how they should touch. For example, hugging is one example, and the pandemic removed these. But for others, it's been a huge loss and it's had a big impact. And as one of my participants put it, touch is sort of illegal. It's like, I know it helps your mental health, but you're not allowed. And this participant spoke about his sense of this touch-barred world very much magnifying his loneliness. And he described it as a kind of downgrade from hugs to handshakes to nothing and being left only with his teddies. And as he put it, at least they don't mind how much I hug them. Some water. So in other cases, there were a few participants who recognised patterns of materials in their lives that gave them comfort. In the image shown here, you can see a map a participant has made about lonely and less lonely times in her life. And then she's taken cuttings from materials and items in her home. And the feel of some of them, like itchy wool from a childhood dress, carry memories and associations to lonely points, while other materials like fur, velvet, satin and pressed flowers have been things that have soothed and comforted her in lonely times. And she talked about the pleasantness of feeling these and how they kind of soothed and comforted her. And the fact that there were even patterns to these materials was actually a revelation for this participant, and she was very surprised to find it. So it might actually be something that some of you at home want to try. You could pick a period of times, like such as the past year, or like this participant over your life. Map times when you felt more and less lonely, and then think about whether there have been any materials that you associate with those things, and materials and objects that you found, the feel of which you found comforting. It's quite an interesting one to try. So there was also a wider pattern to some textures and objects which participants ascribed to loneliness. So people often cited plastics or synthetic materials as feeling lonely. And things that came up with were like qualities like their smoothness, lack of grip, and as well as associations with planetary disconnection and damage to the environment. So how does all this translate when we move across to digital touch technologies? So when I showed participants a selection of touch technologies that have been designed around loneliness or kind of forms of loneliness, like longing and homesickness and things like that, people often use words like weird, wacky, alien, artificial, and there was an overall sense that these technologies, just more often than not, were missing the mark. And it's worth noting that these reactions actually echoed the results of the 2020 touch test. So for those who haven't heard of the touch test, this was an online questionnaire exploring attitudes to touch, and it had about 40,000 plus participants. And it actually included questions about attitudes to digital touch. And interestingly, the results likewise showed that people actually weren't very receptive towards them. And if you'd like to know more, you can see here on this slide, there's a series called The Anatomy of Touch, which talks about the results from the touch test. And there is an episode on digital touch for which Carey from In Touch was also interviewed, and that's a great listen. I highly recommend it. So the second finding, digital touch, is it too hard? So in my study, there were a number of reasons why participants rejected digital touch, but one was to do with the feel and the materials that most of our technologies are made of. So mainly plastics and metals, which were perceived as kind of fake, but especially too hard and too cold, which of course is the opposite to more comforting qualities like warmth and softness. So where people did feel digital touch might support moments of loneliness or support loneliness, they often had a vision that was different to its current form. And I can give you a sense of this through the rough prototypes or mock-ups that I asked participants to make in response to the technologies that they were shown. And the example on this slide by one participant is a flexible textile ribbon. And this participant imagined it as something that could be programmed to give multiple tactile sensations and patterns. So she really wanted lots of options as well, and keeping a sense of communication with the self. But the emphasis is very much on something that's flexible and malleable rather than rigid, and something that can be customized and made as personal as possible. And also move around the body. So a lot of touch technologies do tend to focus on the hand, and perhaps that's a reflection of the way we often think about touch. And if you look at dictionary definitions of touch, they quite often speak about human touch, and particularly touch with the hand or the arm. So another participant's responses on the screen now, from a slightly exploring this idea of whether digital touch is too hard from another angle. So this is an idea for a tree with various petals, which each connect with a different friend or family member. And what was important for this participant was bringing the tactility of the natural world to the technology. So as I said, a lot of the examples, this participant used the words plasticky or fake, and she wanted her technology to be something that was at least partly living and growing. And she spent a lot of time thinking about this living feel of her technology. So, for example, things like having a wood core, a textured Hessian pot, and the feel of the petals being succulent-like with water inside. And this example also shows a theme that runs across many of the technologies participants came up with, that the materials and feel of the technology were often as important, if not more important, than the touch or the physiological sensation that it delivered. And it's also worth noting that these points about the dominance of rigid metals and hard plastics in our technologies are actually circulating more widely in other areas of design. So two areas, in case anyone wants to look this up, anthropomorphic design and somesthetic design are very interested in exploring alternatives. So a third finding is that loneliness has a physicality that can be felt and sometimes hidden. Loneliness is often associated with the word cold, and this came up in this study, of course, along with other tactile sensations of loneliness in the body. Words like numb, heavy, tight, lumpy, dense, and descriptions of moving more slowly. And people also spoke about a disconnection with their own bodies, a sense of a lack of control and discomfort. So of either feeling too much or too little sensation. And another feature of loneliness is its connection with anxiety, and this was articulated by some participants who described these sensations of pins and needles, stomach churning and throbbing, and the sense of the body being out of control, often exacerbating feelings of loneliness. As one participant described it, when my own body pains and betrays me. So this idea of feeling inside the body and loneliness inside the body, and these sensations as less attended to or hidden, they are reflected in one of the designs that a participant made, the prototype or mock-up, as I'm calling it, in case for those of you who aren't familiar with that term. So the image on the left, it's an idea for a body sensing device to uncover the body's hidden memories of loneliness and trauma. And you can wear it, but you can also remove it. And the idea is that you can scan the whole body, exploring the muscles and the joints to uncover this hidden loneliness. And what this also shows, again, is the ideas about touch in the digital being expanded to sense, in this case, perhaps for this hidden and less attended to character of loneliness. So it's not just looking at communicating always with somebody else. And again, it moves away from the hand and the forearm, which is also interesting. And then on the right, you can see images of, you can see nature coming through, essentially. Again, this interest in connecting with nature, and this bag filled with water and this pine branch. which are imagined as a therapeutic means to support the body and as a complement to the technology in this case. And this is the final finding. It's the thought that counts. So as I've mentioned, some participants did think touch, really felt touch was important for supporting loneliness, and they saw a real future for it. And on the other hand, others found the idea of digital touch very uncomfortable. But for many participants, it wasn't so much the physical interactions or physiological sensations that a touch technology might deliver as the thought behind a touch. And this again comes back to the point that sits across these findings, that our ideas about digital touch, or our ideas about touch, are expanding through the digital. So as other studies from In Touch have shown, with digital touch, a lot of what gets included or talked about as touch actually goes beyond these direct physiological sensations like vibration or warmth. It's actually to do a lot with the prior memories and experiences of touch that people bring with them to the technologies and the meanings that they create together. So some of you may have had your own experiences of trying to create a sense of touch or closeness online recently. So some techniques that you might have seen or tried, things like moving extremely close to your screens or whispering into your microphone, or mimicking each other's gestures at the same time, doing the same thing, like hugging or running your hands over your face. So there are several ways that the thought that counts has come through in the data so far. One example emerged through the discussions of the technologies that I showed participants. So this is one of them. This is an empathy box that you can see right now on the screen. And this is actually one of the few that participants were more receptive towards. The box is speculative technology by a designer researcher called Sophia Bruckner. And it's actually inspired by the empathy box in the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which some of you might better know as the film Blade Runner. So the concept is the box is that it creates a connection with lonely strangers, and by holding on to the bars, you can feel warmth and also send warmth and empathy to another anonymous person in your network who also has an empathy box. So to some participants, the warmth appealed, but what a lot of participants most valued was actually the ethos behind it, that you were sharing care and concern in connecting with others. So it's the idea that you're thinking of someone else, or that you're being thought of, that was particularly appealing. And what also emerged was that participants value digital touch as one of many practices that enable them to express and receive these signals of thought and care. So one participant likened it to sending a physical postcard, a tweet, or an emoji. And to them, digital touch was another way to say you can do it. It's a little trigger to get you out of that loneliness spiral. Another example of the thought that counts finding came through in an interview with one of the pairs who later trialled the Hey bracelet. So this is a device that allows you to send a squeeze to someone else with a paired bracelet. So when you touch the top of your bracelet, it gives a little shake, and the other person, hopefully, if it's all working, should feel theirs contract, the strap sort of contracts. And it actually feels a little bit like having your blood pressure taken, a kind of lighter version of that. So in an interview after one of the trials, one of the participants reflected, it's not the digital aspect of it, it's the person behind it. I was almost not even thinking about what's giving me the squeeze, if you know what I mean. I started looking past the bracelet. It was a message from Vic. And you can also see in this example that the technology itself began to recede in a way. And this participant, you know, I think they did it for about 2 months, but they said that if they'd had a little bit longer, they could very much see that actually happening even more. So a final point to add is that our attitudes to touch technologies quite often, but not always, reflects our attitudes to touch more broadly. So it's important to note that this emphasis on the thought that counts was often stronger among those who were less tactile in relation to other people and who therefore didn't necessarily find touch reassuring. So another pair who trialled the bracelets, although they value touch in some ways, they interpreted the bracelet's touch as much more of a grab, and overall they didn't feel it was necessary to carry touch through into the digital realm. And they looked for other mediums to articulate that, that thought, both digital and analog. So in this talk, I've shown you a few of the ways in which participants framed touch and digital touch in loneliness. These are early findings, of course, and even beyond this study, we're still navigating how we understand loneliness and touch in relation to each other. And it's still early days for these kinds of technologies and understanding the role that they might play in our lives. So, of course, the pandemic's created this space for people to think more deeply about these things. But for many, it's not been the case that digital touch is suddenly the answer, and it is more nuanced than that. So one of the key things that sits across these findings is that touch in the digital, that is, our ideas of what digital touch can be and touch can be, are expanding. So with touch comforts, human touch is important, but so too is touch from animals, the natural world, objects, and the feel and sensations of particular materials which hold memories and associations. Digital touch, is it too hard, indicates a desire for more flexible, malleable and customizable technologies. And the physicality of loneliness and touch considers more deeply the idea of loneliness being felt, stored and even hidden in the body, and a need to give this more consideration in general. And as some of the examples, the example prototypes or mock-ups that I showed you for digital touch ideas in these findings show that when people think of digital touch, they're not always positioning it with other humans. And then finally, digital touch, it's the thought that counts, suggests another angle to digital touch, that it's not always the sensation, it's also about the intention to express and receive care and empathy that's behind the touch. And all of these have implications for the future of design of digital touch when it comes to loneliness, and perhaps in some cases more broadly. But I'm very interested to hear from you now in the remaining time that we have for questions. I think we should have at least 20 minutes, hopefully. And please also do feel free to contact me at the email address on the slide, at the bottom of the slide after the talk. I'd be very happy to hear from you. So without further ado, let's go to the questions, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Thanks for that great talk. And you've already got some questions coming through on Slido, and I just encourage everyone again, the app is sli.do. You can post your questions anonymously if you're a little bit shy there. And you can also vote on different questions that others are asking to push them up the order of questioning. So I'll go to Slido now and just see what questions we've got. And just to note, Kristen has commented on touch comforts and how that reminded her of Harlow's heartbreaking experiment of sensory deprived monkeys who would choose a stuffed doll over food. And I know that's a kind of imagery. There's loads of little clips of that on YouTube if anyone's interested in looking at Harlow's experiments around touch and comfort. But the first question for you there is a question around whether or not there's any research on the differences or the pros and cons of different types of technologically mediated touch versus having a pet. I mean, I'm not aware of any, Lili.
No, I'm not. As I said, I think because these are so new, and because also before the start of the pandemic, before it kind of hit us all worldwide, there's so few studies in general, even just looking at loneliness and touch, explicitly at loneliness and touch. And yeah, I don't think we've got that far. I mean, as far as I'm aware, this is where it's at the moment, is just sort of gauging these new things that are coming out. But yeah, that would be interesting actually further down the line to look at that. Yeah.
But certainly I think your work's pulled out that pets have been very very important in the kind of realm of what touch is.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Lots of people talking about their pets and how it kind of really, I think, as I said, help them kind of detach in a way from loneliness, that kind of contact with a living being. Yeah.
Right. And Steph's got a question here as well. So they say, it was wonderful to see the results of what people made in the workshops.
Oh, great.
And what was the thinking for you, analytically, I think they mean, what was the thinking between separating out finding 2 about the hardness and from finding 3 about the physicality? So I guess just wondering why you've separated those themes.
Yeah. Okay, so the physicality was more about the physicality inside the body. So what you, the individual feels or might feel or might not feel or inside the body. So and the is it too hard, that was actually about the technologies themselves and the materiality, the materials, what the technologies are made up of.
Great. Okay. And another listener is asking about the different age groups that you worked with, saying you mentioned that you undertook the research with different age groups. Did you see any variance in how people of the different age groups responded to the technology? That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it massively is. And I mean, it's hard, you know, you try as a researcher to not have too many prejudgments, but you always have your little hypotheses, don't you, in a way. I did expect that perhaps the younger age group would be a bit more receptive and the older age group would be less receptive. But actually, I think what sits across the findings so far is actually that it's much more, it's not so much about the technology as your feelings about touch and you know, those boundaries, those personal boundaries that you might have, and you know who you allow to touch you and who you want to touch you and how much you want touch from another human. So and then also, so what was quite interesting was the older age group particularly, so they noted that a lot of these technologies, they're to connect with somebody else. And they were like, well, hang on, what if I don't have anyone else to connect with? You know, like that might, you know, I've lost my partner, or, not all of them, but, you know, some of them were like, well, you know, maybe I don't have someone I can connect with. So their reactions were to kind of create things that were for them. So like much more what they saw as like more kind of positive, so a technology that might welcome them in the home, that they could sort of feel as they entered the home, that created this welcoming space, and then or more about communication with the self and connection with the self, and then with the younger age group, the 18 to 24, I mean, the only thing I would say, it wasn't so much about the touch technologies. It was, I had a few things where the younger group, especially, they would say, sometimes I feel lonely when I'm not in touch, like I don't have my phone to hand, and I'm not feeling the vibration of messages and things like that, which was something that I perhaps expected a little bit more.
Cool. I think that's interesting as well, because it really brings all of our attention to thinking about touch, not just being as this thing with another or with an object, but that we also have, like, you know, touch experience with ourselves. And I think a lot of us were, you know, like hugging and doing a lot of self-soothing during isolation. So thank you for bringing our attention to that. So Ellie's got a question, which is, people have voted to be quite popular. So thanks, Ellie. The question, she says, or they say, thanks, Lili. Did you find there was a stigma towards the adoption of using digital touch bracelets to overcome loneliness?
Yeah, so that is a really, really good point, and that's actually potentially one of the findings as well that's emerging. So I didn't include it just because of the time in this talk, but that's spot on. That is something that's coming through. So some people did say, like, oh, I've heard of that technology. They talked about the hay bracelet, and they said, oh, but I don't want to be that sad person. They said they were worried that they might be perceived as somehow needy, or you know, or a bit sad. And that's quite interesting as well, because loneliness still carries a lot of stigma, though there's a lot of work being done at the moment by different groups like the Loneliness Lab to remove that stigma and get people talking. But yeah, that definitely carries through across the technologies. And then another thing that was quite interesting was people in their designs, they didn't want it to just be a technology for helping them with loneliness or helping them feel connected, or they wanted it to be something else as well. So they wanted it to look nice in the home, or they wanted it to be something that was exciting and attractive, and you know, that could also be a sculpture in their hallway, for example, or you know, so it was about the touch, but it was so much more about the touch as well, and even like the aesthetic of the technology. So with the hay bracelet, you know, some people absolutely loved it, thought it was great, and some people, I actually had one group, one pair, he said, oh, it looks a bit like an ASBO. It felt like an ASBO. I was expecting it to be like a Fitbit. So there's kind of different layers of potential stigma coming in there. That was quite interesting.
Oh, that's great. There's a couple of questions. Given that you at this moment have been very excitable, I'm going to ask you this lovely question that Anonymous has asked, which is, during your research, Lili, did you come across a touch technology that you wish you had, or a thing that has great potential to connect people and to reduce loneliness?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, I haven't thought about that one, and I'm definitely going to have to think about that one some more, because I'm not sure I'm going to come up with a satisfactory answer there. But I think that comes back to the point that maybe they're not quite there yet. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I like the idea, which a lot of participants also said, and I think I've hinted at, is that the technology does more than touch. So that whether it's something that's actually attractive to, if it's a wearable technology, something that's actually attractive to wear. So I suppose actually the empathy box that I showed as an example, that designer, she also did an empathy amulet, and I quite liked that. It was quite I like quite chunky jewelry. I'm not wearing chunky jewelry today because it fades into my background, but I like quite chunky jewelry, and it's this quite cool, like if you look it up, it's this quite cool piece. So I think that idea that I could sort of be wearing it, but then touch it and feel that warmth, or send somebody that warmth, and perhaps, you know, nobody else knows, and it's just for me. I think that's very appealing, and that speaks to a lot of people.
Okay, well, you've brought us back to the empathy box. I'm just going to collect a couple of questions that were a little bit about your methods. I'm not sure, just knowing a little bit about your research, how relevant they are, but I think you could address them and let people know kind of how you dealt with these questions. The one question is, was any data collected around the sensory needs regarding the touch of participants who identified as autistic?
So I didn't have, to my knowledge, any participants who identified as autistic, so I can't answer that question. I mean, certainly through the discussions we did speak about, you know, every participant kind of explains in some, or expressed their relationship to touch, and what they felt they needed from touch, whether it was another person or objects or animals or whatever. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I can't answer that in terms of autism, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think it's, I suppose, just through your work and the reading, the literature you've done, then you have engaged with the idea that people have different relationships to touch. I don't know if you want to say a little about that, or
I mean, they do. I mean, I think what's interesting is maybe in the literature there's less reflection, or the literature that I found, there's less reflection on people who might not want it, or may have a more boundaried relationship to touch. It's quite often that touch is very positive, it's something we all need more of, which is true. A lot of people feel that, genuinely feel that, but I would say that other side to things probably needs a bit more reflection, actually.
Right, okay. And someone else asking, how did you define empathy in the context of your empathy tool, and how did you evaluate the outcome? So perhaps you just situate the empathy box for them a little bit, and you know, explain maybe that your methods aren't about that, you're not approaching things in that way. I don't know, maybe give us a sense of how that fits.
Yeah, I suppose the empathy box was just, so I wasn't trying to necessarily explore empathy per se. I was interested in this kind of broad brush approach, kind of like just looking across not quite everything, but as much as I could contain realistically in the study. I think what was interesting about that box, reading about that designer researcher's work, and I'd recommend, you know, this, she's got some pieces published online which are free and available if you want to find out more. Yeah, what was interesting is the way she positioned that touch technology as something that's other technologies fall short, and this was something different, and that could really, you know, you're not using words, and you're kind of it's sort of like an unspoken, a non-verbal empathy, so kind of feeling with somebody. That's how I've understood it, but I would go to her study there to find out more.
But I guess you were more concerned with understanding people's experiences than necessarily evaluating the concepts as well, or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so understanding what. So yeah, I think I've lost track of the question now.
Oh, well, let's move. There's just another question about your method, which is about your use of creative methods. Someone's saying that they really enjoyed looking at some of the things that your participants had made. And could you just talk a little bit more about that, like what things came up that were unexpected for you in the research from the objects that people made?
Yeah, so there were some that were more expected, so things like you know, like blankets or things that could hug you. What came up? So I think the ones that I picked were quite interesting to me because they really struck me. So obviously that's part of the reason that I included them. I had a sculpture that was like this sort of amorphous shape that was described as sort of, it had to be very squishy, and it had these tiny robot arms. I don't quite understand how it worked, but this is the whole point of being more speculative. And they had these tiny little robot arms inside that could sort of move the sculpture with you. And I really enjoyed that idea that it would be there, and that also that it would invite other people to touch as well. So it was meant to be something that was kind of for them, but also to be shared with other people. I really liked that. Yeah. My mind's gone blank. Oh, there are plenty. I've just had a blank.
I'm just finding a final, I think we're moved towards it. If anyone wants to kind of ping any questions, I'll go for it. So there's a bit of questions here around kind of robots versus and robotic pets and technologies that imitate pets. So people are wondering if you came across any technologies that imitated pets around touch.
Yeah. quite a few. So there's things like Paro, the baby seal robot, which is probably one of the most famous, that's been kind of around for some time now, which is often used in care homes for people with, often with people with dementia. But it's sort of meant to be very kind of soothing, but also loneliness as well. And then,
sorry, Lili, just because with Paro, is that, does it give, so people touch it, and what kind of?
Yeah, so it has touch sensors. So it kind of uses different technology. So it has movement, so it responds to touch and how you're touching it, and it makes little noises. So it's kind of a multi-sensory pet item, and yeah, it responds to how you're engaging with it, and if you treat it badly, it gets upset as well. Yeah, so it's meant to be very therapeutic and meant to, I don't know exactly, I think the studies are inconclusive as to loneliness, but it has been shown to be quite therapeutic and very soothing, because obviously in the care home space you can't unfortunately have pets for or not have them for too long for various reasons. But yeah, there was also, I think there was a small scale study where I think they wanted to recreate pets that were like little dolls, but then they didn't really appeal to participants, because they were like, oh, but what about, everyone was very worried about the machine inside. I don't want to feel the machine inside. And again, that was to do with that hardness. Yeah.
Right. And this is going to be our final question. And it's a great question. So did you have a go at prototyping a touch technology with your participants? And if so, what did you design? And if not, what would you design?
Oh, that is a good question. No, so I didn't do it with the participants, I suppose, because I was doing all the facilitation and stuff. I have done lots of, I have been a participant in other studies that have involved prototyping, and I have really enjoyed it, which is one of the reasons I wanted to use that method. But yeah, I mean, I think that I would probably, as I said about the empathy amulet, I would probably choose something, and also with a background in fashion, I would probably choose something that I could wear, and that would look really attractive as well, that would feel nice, that would give me a nice feeling, like warmth, or a little vibration. Like I loved the hay bracelet, the little blood pressure sensation. So things like that I would really love. Yeah, things that something that I could wear would be really nice.
Great. Okay, well, look, thank you, Lili. Thanks for your talk. Thanks for everybody who's joined us today, and for all of those who've asked such interesting questions. Thank you very much. Just to mention that you can see upcoming lectures by visiting the UCL Minds webpage. That, as Lili said, you'll be sent an email with further links and information, and do reach out to Lili if you want to hear more about her study. And yeah, just stay well, and thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.